actually, that's just
yes. So I want to listen to the advanced one afterwards, because that's obviously the next thing I'm going to do. So I want to make sure they're recording that one for me. So hi everybody. I'll just see if I can share my slides. Hopefully I can.
That looks good. And likewise, if people have questions for Natalie, please pop them in the chat and we can.
Yeah, please do. So hopefully my slides are up there now. I'm running.
Looks good.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Natalie Edelman, now doctor, thanks to my doctoral fellowship. I'm based in what is now called the School of Sport and Health Sciences at Brighton Uni, where I've been for a long, long time. So yeah, I'll give you an outline of what I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes. I guess because we've changed our timings, I'll be finishing at about 20 past, won't I? Yeah, so I'll give you a brief personal context, because everybody comes to these fellowships from a different place. And I was going to talk about the 4 areas that you'll be assessed on what it looks like to put together a good application, on preparing for interview if you get shortlisted, and your interview presentation specifically, and how you might think about dealing with interview questions. So I hope that sounds like it will be a useful session. So the personal context. So I applied for and started my doctoral fellowship in 2013. So the application went in, I think, January 13, and I started in the October, if I remember rightly. I definitely started in 2013. So caveat that some of my information might be a little bit out of date, but as I understand it, not a great deal has changed. I was an RDS advisor actually in the team with Claire before I won the fellowship. So I can't really take off my RDS previous hat. So I guess some of what I'm going to be saying in terms of advice comes from my personal experience as an award holder and applicant, but also as an RDS advisor as well. They're kind of a little bit enmeshed, I think, for me. Yeah, I did my fellowship part-time over 5 years. Yeah, I'm pleased to say that I was one of the first part-time fellowships after I'd actually myself lobbied that they changed the rules. And it was really nice going to the first annual, because if you're successful, you get to go to an annual sort of event for doctoral fellowship holders, which is a really lovely thing. And it was so nice because I ended up at a table with about a meeting about 2 or 3 other people who had only been able to do one because they were part-time. So that felt really lovely to have been part of making that happen. Yeah, so as you've probably been aware, but you might not if you haven't looked into doctoral fellowships yet, you need 2 kinds of hosts. You have a host institution, which is normally your employer, and you have an academic institution, which is where your PhD is hosted. So Brighton University were my host institution, because I was already working there as a research advisor for the RDS, but my academic institution, where the PhD itself was housed, was Brighton and Sussex Medical School in Primary Care and Public Health Department. And I still hold an honorary fellowship there now, actually, which is really nice. That's turned into an ongoing collaboration, and I've published a couple of papers with people from that department since. So yes, that's the first thing to think about, is your host and academic institution, and the idea they can be the same thing, they can be different as well. Either option is possible. So the very first thing to say, the real headline, is fellowships are not ordinary research grants. So an ordinary research grant is going to be primarily reviewed on the basis of the value of doing the study and the rigour by which you're proposing to do it. So your methodological approach and the rigour of that. And then there is obviously some attention to who's applying and whether they fit the remit for that particular grant scheme. But the main focus, the primary focus, I think, would be on the study itself, the quality of the study and its value to society. Whereas in a fellowship application, you're judged equally on the study, yourself as a candidate, the institution, and by that I mean the academic institution, not the host institution, importantly, so the institution housing the PhD, and your supervisory team. So it's a little bit different. There's a lot more to consider, and I think that's really important, because if you only pay attention to that first thing that I've circled, then you might well fall down on the other 3. It's really important who you've got behind you and who you are yourself, and whether this fits your trajectory, your sort of narrative of why you want to do the doctorate. So yeah, but I will begin by talking about these issues of study, value and rigour, and the different aspects of that. So for me, there's 4 key things to be thinking about when you're thinking about the study design itself that you'll want to take forward in your doctoral fellowship. Firstly, you always need a good rationale. You need that for pretty much any kind of funding application to do a piece of research. But obviously with NIHR, there's specific rationales in terms of applicability, in particular sort of values and mission statements they're seeking to meet. So I would always say begin by looking at the NIHR's key statements, key documents, key goals, and make sure that the study that you're proposing to do as your PhD aligns with that rationale, your own rationale aligns with the sort of NIHR's own remit and with the remit of the doctoral fellowship. And it's really fine to do that in a very sort of open way. You know, you can really say this study aligns with theme 3, or, you know, the core value of, or NIHR's mission statement 2, or whatever. You know, it's really fine to be very explicit, because I always think, this has been putting the RDS back on a bit, that, you know, the people who are making the decisions about whether they fund your doctoral application are themselves accountable to other people. They're accountable for the decisions they're making. So the easier you make it for them to go, oh yeah, look, she's ticked that box, she's ticked that box, the better, because that's kind of there's somebody upstream who's kind of, they need to be accountable for. So they can't just go, oh, I like the sound of this. They're obviously, as people assessing you, thinking, does this fit our remit? So make that as easy for them as possible to spot that you fit their remit as the National Institute for Health Research, and for the doctoral scheme specifically. Another really obvious one but gets missed is having really clear aims and outputs. So what will the output of the study be? Not just the outcome, which is possibly what you're measuring if you're using a quantitative approach, but what the output is. So like, what will you actually have as demonstrable thing that you can offer the world at the end of your fellowship? Like, what piece of knowledge, what kind of outputs, what will that look like? Will it be a toolkit? Will it be some published papers? Will it be key sets of recommendations? All sorts of things, but clear aims and outputs. And what's always really good is when your aims for your study meet the rationale. So they clearly follow from that rationale story of why the research needs doing, and that those aims are then articulated in clear objectives, and that all of your study plans meet those objectives. So you can say, you know, my systematic review will address objective 1, which is identifying existing interventions, blah, 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 or whatever it might be. But really map your aims and your objectives to the methods you're using and to the outputs that you'll get. So there's a really clear trajectory that people can see. The third thing, when they're assessing the study value and rigor, is to really think about having an appropriate and feasible methodology. It's a doctoral study, so you don't need to be solving all the world's wicked problems. And you know, it needs to be right-sized for a PhD. So 1 study is probably not going to be big enough. 8 is probably going to be too many. So, you know, this is where your RDS advisors can be really helpful in terms of thinking about making sure all of this is right, actually, making sure all of this is right. So do you go to your RDS advisors, but definitely thinking about, is this right-sized for a doctoral fellowship in particular? So are you proposing something feasible? And in particular, what can really help is if you're saying you'll recruit X number of patients, any kind of existing data that you can throw in to say, this is based on, we already know 100 patients come through this clinic, or we already know that this GP practice has X number of people who are in the target population of interest, you know, who are women aged under 30 or whatever it might be. So really making sure that you've got a sound basis for what you're suggesting as your methods and your methodology as well. And then also good attention to patient public involvement and to equality, diversity and inclusion. So both of those issues are really, really important. And I'd recommend you look up, long since my day, there's now been a lot more guidance on these issues, in particular addressing inequalities in who takes part in research and work. And there's definitely some training videos that are now available from the NIHR on sort of decolonizing your research, in particular making sure you're recruiting from Black and minority ethnic populations, and a lot of that's quite transferable to other areas as well, and other sort of less well researched groups. So that things are making sure that you've just really thought about your approach to patient public involvement, but also that you've thought about EDI. That's the one that I think gets missed a little bit, is equality, diversity, inclusion. So really think about how you're paying attention to that in your study design. So that for me is the key things about the study that they're probably going to be looking at. But like I said, I did mine a long time ago. Go back to your RDS advisors. I haven't done that for a number of years now, and they can advise you in more detail about all of this and if there's anything I might have missed as well. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was the candidate, you as a candidate, and the case that you make for you doing the PhD, because it's not enough just to put down your name and your CV and where you're at. You need to sell to them why you need to be doing the PhD in this way. Like, why not do a PhD another way? Why do you want a fellowship to do it? You know, fellowships are expensive. They're really expensive because you're asking for study costs, but you're also asking for your PhD fees. You're asking for your salary to be backfilled. You know, there's going to be a good rationale for why you're doing the fellowship, as opposed to just doing a study. And that's one of the key questions they will ask. So yeah, we're going to move on now and think about the candidate and then institution and supervisors. So you really need to pay attention to all 4 of these areas. Actually, I'll go back a bit and just say if there's anything else I wanted to say on that. I don't think there really is, except that, yeah, with the candidate, you've really got to pay attention to a key trajectory of why now, why this scheme, why you're the person to do it. And actually, with regard to EDI, I personally think it's absolutely fine to make the case that this is the way that you can do a PhD. For me, it was absolutely that. It was like, if I don't win this fellowship, I can't do a PhD. I had young children, I had big mortgage. There was no way that I could do a PhD without being backfilled from my current job to undertake it. I didn't have the finance or the time to do it any other way. And I was upfront about that at my interview, actually. Yeah, making sure that you're able to say that your institution is a good one, why they're the right institution, and why the supervisors are right as well. So here you might want to talk about if there's research centres that are particularly affiliated or relevant to the work that you're planning. So, for example, I recently put in a fellowship application looking at antimicrobial resistance, and I was able to talk about the fact that we've got the TACTIC network looking at antimicrobial resistance in Brighton and Sussex Medical School. So that's the kind of thing you're talking about with the institution. And with the supervisors themselves, you want to be able to say that across your supervisory team, which is normally 2 or 3 people, I named 3 on mine, I think that's probably the norm still, that you're covering all your areas. And that means, when I say covering all your areas, what I mean is that across those supervisory team, the topic there needs to be somebody who's an expert in your topic and somebody who's expert in your methodology as well. So it's not enough there's no point in doing if you're doing a qualitative study on dementia and both your supervisors are dementia experts but they're quantitative, it's not going to fly, because you haven't got anybody with expertise in the right kind of methodology. So your supervisors need to cover the topics of interest. So I was looking at psychosocial predictors of sexual risk in British general practice populations. So I needed somebody who had quant skills for that. I needed somebody who was expert in sexual health. I needed somebody who was expert in primary care. So it was making sure that I had those 3 areas covered. So it's almost like when you're doing a systematic review, thinking about what are the key concepts within my title that cover the population, the sort of disease or position, situation or circumstance that I'm looking at, and that cover the methodology. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that. Yeah, so getting a good application together. Well, obviously I've talked about those 4 areas, and those really are the 4 key areas. So do pay attention to all of them. Give yourself 6 months minimum, absolute minimum, I would say, to start working on this, unless you've already got an idea and the grant part of it is pretty well written, as in the study idea of it's pretty well written, but that they do take time to develop. Bring the RDS on board early, because they can help network you with people, they can help tell you if you're out of scope, and believe me, you don't want to spend an awful long time writing something and then find that actually you're out of scope way down the line. And bring finance in early as well. Just make them aware that you're doing this application, and working out who's going to support the finance can sometimes be a bit tricky, depending on whether your host institution is different to your academic institution. Depending on the kind of study you're designing, you might need what's called a SOCAT, which is an attribution of NHS costs that will require other people to be brought in from the clinical research network. So it's really important to start asking that question about finance first, because you might have to go to a couple of people before you work out who's the person who'll actually help you do the costings. You know, it's not the big danger is when people think, oh, I'll just add up the finance things in the last 3 weeks, because it really doesn't work like that. And you need to make sure you're in scope as well financially, that you're not going over budget. The other thing I would say is talk to everyone about your idea, just like chew everybody's ears off about it. Do that at work, do that with academics, do that with clinical colleagues, and do it with friends. Just do it anywhere and everywhere you can, because all those bits of feedback are really useful. If people go, I don't know what you mean, do you mean this or do you mean that? That's useful feedback for, oh, okay, I'm not telling my story clearly here. Or people may well say, oh, have you thought about that? Or did you know this measure existed? Or I've read a paper that's similar, or whatever. So be flexible and open to change, as in take that feedback and recognise that actually your initial plans might not be possible. So try not to be too rigid, because you may well have to adapt what you originally planned to fit in with the NIHR remit and the feedback you're getting. I'd also say do something you feel passionate about. You know, the application process is a long one, then you've got a long wait till interview, then you've got another wait to hear, and then you've got at least 3 years studying the topic. So choosing a topic just because you think it's going to be of interest to the RDS, or not the RDS, the NIHR, but that you're not passionate about is not a good idea, because you've really got to have a passion to do a PhD, I think. You know, there's a kind of an emotional load with doing a PhD around belief in yourself. You know, it's quite a journey. There's ups and downs, and if you're doing something where you really feel like this is worthwhile, this is important to do, gives you meaning, then I think that's really important. Do something as well that fits your story and hopes as an academic. So if you can say, this builds on my interests in this builds on the way that I've already looked at this particular topic. It might be that you've looked at it in clinical practice, or you've already looked at it in research, or you might be able to say, I've looked at similar areas, but I've always used qualitative methods and I want to get more into epidemiology or whatever. So be able to sort of tell a story that takes you to the point of the PhD. And your aspirations as an academic are really important as well. So they're not funding, the NIHR aren't funding PhDs for people who just want to return to clinical practice and never do any research ever again. You know, it's really about talking about your aspirations to be a clinical academic, or an academic if you're on the pure pathway, and how you might develop your research career going forward, as well as what you might take back to clinical practice. So you need to be able to tell not just the story of what came before your application, but the story of what comes after. Make sure your plans are realistic, which I think I've said already. I think most PhDs are somewhere between 1 and 2 literature reviews, and then between 1 and 3 studies at most. Don't have unrealistic plans, because that will look not like you're really enthusiastic and ambitious. It might look like you're enthusiastic and ambitious, but it will also look like you're a bit naive and you're not aware of quite what's involved. And again, this is where your RDS can really, really help you. If possible, find supervisors who can work together well and who engage. So not everybody has the best experience with supervisors, being able to actually meet with them regularly, give them feedback, or occasionally people can end up in situations where their supervisors have got very different views and don't particularly get on well. I say that because I worked in research for a good 10 years before I applied for my PhD. So I saw a little bit of that. So for me, it was really important to find a supervisory team who I knew had a bit of track record of working together already. So my primary supervisor had worked with each of the secondary supervisors, but the secondary supervisors hadn't worked together. That was kind of ideal, because I could tell the story of it being a new collaboration, but also that there was an established track record of these 2 people, my primary supervisor publishing previously with this person and with that person. And that then it gives the NIHR assurance that you know that this is going to fly, that this isn't going to create problems, that this is going to work well as a team. And be prepared to get lots of feedback. You know, that is basically being an academic in a nutshell, is you get lots of feedback. You get loads of feedback when you submit a paper, you get loads of feedback when you submit a grant, or when you discuss an idea. It's feedback. So it's like, that is part of the process, is critique. You know, we ask for critique and we get it, and learning to be robust about that and recognize that that's just part of the process. It doesn't mean you're rubbish or you shouldn't be doing it. It's all good, because actually better the critique and the feedback before you submit or before you get to interview than at that stage, as much as possible. It's like bulletproofing it, I suppose. Okay, so if that's talking about the application, I'm now just going to talk about the preparing for the interview. So let's assume that you've got through the first stage and well done, and now you're preparing for your interview. So there's three aspects, I think, to preparing for an interview. Firstly is panel members, getting to know who your panel members are. So being aware of who you're going to be interviewed by. Secondly, preparing your presentation. And thirdly, preparing your response to questions. So those are three different areas you can prepare. And being prepared is always such a good thing, because it just brings your anxiety levels down a load if you know you've done your homework. So for your panel members, I don't know if this is still the case. When I did it, you could certainly see in advance who your panel members were going to be. Oh, you still can, Claire. That's great to know. Yeah, so find out who they are and find out what their disciplines are. And have they published on anything related? So basically, oh, sorry, I've gone ahead. So basically what you'll find is that because the panels are very broad, because they're looking at a huge range of topics, there's probably going to be, I mean, I did it, I think the panel was 12 or 13 people. It's quite big. It might be a bit smaller now, I don't know, but that's my memory. Yeah, okay, it's still quite big. So it's basically, but there will be at least 2 people, probably 3, who've got some relevant expertise. So it's really working out, okay, amongst that panel, you know, these are the people who have got relevant knowledge, expert knowledge that the panel as a whole are probably going to look to when they're making the decision after I've gone out the room. Have they published on anything related? So have a look at their publications, see what they've worked on anything related. And yeah, pick 3 or 4 who are likely to have expertise or subject knowledge, or who might have bugbears as well about what you're doing. You know, that's also really important. So say, for example, you said that you'll use backwards stepwise regression, and when you look up the public health person, they only ever use forwards or something, then that's your cue to go, oh yeah, make sure I've got a really robust argument for why I'm using backwards. Or say to, or think about saying in your presentation, no, obviously I'd be open to other methods such as forwards. You know, it's just knowing who you're going to be addressing, I suppose. Now, this only really applies if it's face to face, and as I understand it, that's kind of up in the air at the moment. But if it's possible that it's going to be face to face, learn their names and their faces of those 3 or 4 people in particular. And what happened with me is we got taken into an ante room before we went into the main interview room, and they had a flip chart up, and they had a like horseshoe showing the table set up with who was sitting where. So I was able to go, okay, my primary care person is immediately on my left, and my sexual health person is to the left of the chair. And so when I'm talking primary care, I'm going to make sure I catch their eye. When I'm talking sexual health, I'm going to make sure I catch their eye. It's all very technical, isn't it? But you know, why not? You know, you put a lot of work in, make sure you've covered as many bases as possible, I say. So yeah, that's talking about the panel members. And now coming to the presentation itself, practicing your presentation. So the real thing here is practice it.
Exactly. We're 5 minutes out from being pulled back. Did you see? Good.
Yeah. So practice it, get feedback, practice it, get feedback, keep going. Refine it and refine it. Claire and colleagues, I think, must have sat through about 6 of my presentations. Have your talk on cards or notes, because you only get 5 minutes. So that's not time to riff. That's when you want to be very precise about what you're saying. Check your timings and don't go over, they cut you off. And don't try to say too much. Try and just get over the key points. Begin by saying who you are, make eye contact, and summarize your background and why you want the award in literally 1 sentence for the latter, and be very brief. Follow that formula of background, aims, methods, and impact story, and then mention the institution and supervisors in 1 slide, I would say, and use visuals. So a flow diagram of the research process with the research timeline on it is really nice. So year 1, systematic review and blah, blah. Year 2, whatever, you know. So have really nice brief slides. And then lastly, preparing for and dealing with questions. So make sure beforehand that you critique your own applications. Have a good break from it after you've submitted it. And then you can go through and critique it yourself and go, oh, I didn't address that, or that bit's a bit flaky, or let me think about that. Think about 3 points that you want to communicate to the panel. There will be bits that you didn't put in the application that you wish you had. And this is your chance to be a politician. And when you've answered a question, take the opportunity to say, can I also add, and then add one of those 3 points that you wish you'd said in your application. So that's an opportunity to do that. Don't be afraid to ask for clarification or for somebody to be a question to be rephrased. And don't be afraid to say, let me think about that for a moment, and jot the answer down, the question down rather, and just give yourself a minute to pause and think. That's fine. That shows you're a considered person, that you're confident. They're not going to expect you to have every answer off pat. And don't be afraid to say that you'd consider incorporating a suggestion to thank the panel member for it. Oh, thank you, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that method. That's definitely something I would consider incorporating, or I'd definitely talk to my supervisors about revising that to incorporate what you're suggesting, or whatever. So don't be afraid to do that either, because that shows you're flexible. And finally, if at first you don't succeed, then try again. I got mine the second time round. It opens up a lot of doors, and it's a really wonderful experience to be on a doctoral fellowship. It's so wonderful. And if you do get the chance, do enjoy the experience as much as you can, and good luck. And yeah, I've got a couple of minutes hopefully left at the end. Sorry, I talked a bit longer than I planned.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Natalie. We've got one question from Lainey. Lainey, would you like to ask your question? It's a really good one.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Natalie. I've took reams and reams of notes there that would be so useful. And what I was wondering is just whether you would recommend disclosing that you are a person with lived experience of your project, or whether that could work against you in terms of bias and rigor design. Just, I know there's mixed opinions on that, so just your thoughts.
Oh, that's an interesting one, because I did mine a while ago. I genuinely don't know if I could comment on whether or not it would be, I doubt it would go against you. I think you would need to show that you absolutely got rigor as well in what you're doing. Personally, I have started to write more myself and publish more on those links between lived experience and the idea that you can have lived experience and still have an academic viewpoint as well. I'm just trying to think. I published a paper with Duncan Barron, who was our old PPI lead. So if you look up Edelman and Barron, you'll find there's a paper, and in it we reference somebody who basically said, we basically challenged the idea that you can't do that. We basically say, yeah, you can hold both positions at once. So, you know, you might want to, if you do decide to do it, but I would personally say politically, this is definitely something we need to be advocating for more. This, you know, and that integrating one's lived experience and getting rid of this objective notion that we all sit and talk about participants as if they're others, as if we didn't potentially have the experience. Oh, thank you. Claire's just put the link into the paper. So yeah, but I would take RDS advice on it, but I think you could definitely under EDI really make a case for it. So look up the NIHR's position on EDI, for example, and just make sure that you're really framing doing that within some, you know, some supportive literature and within the NIHR's own values.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. And thank you for that paper as well, Claire. Appreciate that.
I also think this could be a question for the next session on PPI.
Yes. Yeah, that would be great.
Right. I think we need to leave the room, I believe.